the handful of times Bernie has given awesome presentations, I giggle almost. And I know this is frustrating for him because something always happens, like the sound, the power goes out. This is the second time the power's been out when you preach, right?
Yeah.
It's wild, but Bernie's a good sport, and not only is he a good sport, he's an amazing communicator. You're really going to enjoy this lesson. So without further ado, y'all give it up for Bernie.
So my title this morning is What Every Christian Ought to Know About the Bible But Usually Doesn't. While doing my doctoral dissertation field research from 2016 to 2018, one of my key informants was Bill Bjorkman, then an assistant pastor of the Regeneration Church, one of the two Calvary chapels evangelical churches in western Santa Cruz County. My many visits to Calvary chapels included a midweek Wednesday evening sermon by Bjorkman on chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, the first book in the Hebrew Bible. The sermon was the beginning of a series of midweek sermons on the entire book of Genesis that would stretch from September 21, 2016 to August 2, 2017. Bjorkman was thus setting the stage for a nearly year-long study. Here is an extended quote from that sermon. Tonight, we go back to where it all began. In fact, we read in the very first words here in the first book of the Bible. It starts out with, "In the beginning." This is the beginning of the record of God's dealings with mankind. Penned by Moses, the pages of this book record the beginning of everything. The beginning of creation, the origins of the universe, the order, the complexity, the solar system, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the origins of life, man, marriage, evil, language, government, culture, nations, religion, all of these different things. And of course, Moses wasn't alive when all the events in the book of Genesis occurred. So we believe he wrote the book with help from some actual written records from the past that God had supernaturally preserved. Let's read that last sentence again. So we believe he wrote the book with the help of some actual written records from the past that God had supernaturally preserved. Right from the beginning, then, in his explanation of the first book of the Bible, Bjorkman has to resort to magic to sustain his narrative of how this book was written. Bjorkman then explains that he is relying on the ideas of Henry Morris, a professor of hydrologic engineering and the primary founder of the contemporary resurgence of young earth creationism. Morris's 1961 book, The Genesis Flood, had the effect of giving young earth creationism a renewed measure of respectability and indeed elevating it, in the opinion of the leading historian of American creationism, Ronald L. Numbers, to a position of fundamentalist orthodoxy, an opinion on strong display at all of my Calvary Chapel locations. Bjorkman shared this quote from Morris. Thus it is probable that the book of Genesis was written originally by actual eyewitnesses of the events reported therein. Probably original narratives were recorded on tables of stone or clay in common practice of early times, and then handed down from father to son, finally coming into the possession of Moses. Moses perhaps selected the appropriate sections for compilation, inserted his own editorial additions and comments, and provided smooth transitions from one document to the next, with the final result being the book of Genesis as we have received it. This view of Genesis and its authorship by a figure known as Moses is common among evangelicals and universal amongst the Calvary chapels, and universal among Calvary chapels, at least the ones I visited in the course of my research. How does it square with contemporary scholarship on the book of Genesis and on the Hebrew Bible? And how do interpretations of the Christian New Testament in Calvary chapels compare to current scholarship regarding that collection of books? The gulf in interpretation of these ancient literatures between the poles of American Protestantism I explored in my research, to a substantial degree, revolves around core convictions about these ancient manuscripts. While the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament are core texts for many Americans and have been foundational to much of the history of Western civilization, it is increasingly true that even cursory knowledge of these texts is declining, even among those who claim to revere them. As one who writes and periodically lectures on American religion, I cannot assume that my listeners or readers will have any knowledge of these texts. What I am beginning this morning is a 7-part series laying out the consensus view of mainstream scholars about what can be known about these manuscripts and the motivations of their authors in writing them in their historical context. Tens of thousands of books have been written about the Bible. There are libraries filled with books and journals dedicated to its interpretation and its exegesis. Here I will provide, in 7 parts, a brief, comparatively speaking, survey of contemporary scholarship. These biblical materials, claimed by a plurality of humanity to be in some way sacred, constitutes a complex anthology. The oldest material in the Hebrew Bible likely is a short passage in the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating to sometime in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, a paraphrased version of which is reproduced and integrated into the text of chapter 9 of the Hebrew Bible book of Ecclesiastes. The last book written chronologically and included in the Christian New Testament is likely 2 Peter, an anonymous letter falsely attributed to Jesus' disciple Peter, which is dated to the mid-2nd century of the Common Era, perhaps as late as 120 years after the likely life of the itinerant Galilean teacher and movement leader known as Jesus. I will be relying on 2 widely used introductory college textbooks, Michael Coogan's The Old Testament, Historical and Literary Introduction to Hebrew Scriptures, and Bart Ehrman's The New Testament, a historical introduction to early Christian writings, supplemented by other material as necessary to set forth this summary. Who wrote the Torah, Pentateuch? The idea that the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible was the world's oldest book held throughout most of the 2 millennia of Christian-influenced Western history. It purports, after all, to faithfully record the origins of the universe, the world, and humanity, and it narrates the global flood. All this was simply accepted at face value, though through most of Christian and Jewish history, including the assertion that this history had been written by Moses. This last point of Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, referred to both as the Torah or the Pentateuch, was challenged at least as early as the 17th century by the political theorist Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan, published in 1668, where he briefly argued that at a minimum, Moses could not have authored all of the Torah. 2 years later, the famed Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who had read Hobbes, went further and contended that the belief that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch is ungrounded and even irrational, and argued instead that the ancient Israelite figure of Ezra had composed the Pentateuch. 8 years after Spinoza's argument, the French Catholic priest Richard Simon produced a comprehensive critique of the idea of Mosaic authorship, noting that the Torah itself nowhere claims to have been written by Moses, and that various historical details in the Torah render Mosaic authorship impossible. In the mid-18th century, the French physician de Louis XV, Jean Astruc, attempted to uphold Mosaic authorship while acknowledging that Moses must have been relying on earlier written but now lost sources. One of the details Astruc relied upon for this conclusion is that Genesis uses 2 different Hebrew words for the deity, Elohim and Yahweh, traditionally translated into English as God and Lord God, respectively. Building on this recognition of at least 2 different sources, scholars over the last century identified multiple sources within the Torah. In 1878, German scholar Julius Wellhausen published his History of Israel, which was translated into English under his supervision as the Prolegomena to the History of Israel, where he laid out the classic exposition that is now known as the documentary hypothesis. The hypothesis posits that the Torah is spliced together from 4 primary sources, the oldest being materials written by the Yahwist, so named for his or her use of the divine name of Yahweh, probably composed in the 9th or 10th century BCE, and the Elohist, who used Elohim as the divine name. 3, the Deuteronomist or Deuteronomic source, found primarily in the last book of the Torah. And 4, a priestly source, so named for its concern with religious law, observance, and ritual, suggesting an origination amongst the priestly class. These 4 sources are by convention abbreviated as J, E, D, and P. P, being the last of the 4 sources, shaped the final form of the Torah, producing their own creation narrative, which they placed at the beginning, and wrote the concluding chapter of Deuteronomy. A majority of scholars, if by no means all, continue to follow some version of Wellhausen's classic formulation of the documentary hypothesis. This documentary hypothesis, though still debated among Hebrew Bible scholars, has proven to be a valuable tool of illumination about what the Torah is, who wrote it, why they wrote it, and what competing political agendas they hope to further in telling the story the way they did. Just as a teaser preview, the famous story about the golden calves at the base of Mount Sinai is likely a made-up polemic written by a writer in the southern kingdom of Judah to make the competing center of religious ritual up the road in Bethel in the northern kingdom of Israel look bad. To be continued.
I love it when Bernie gives his presentations. I learned so much. And I get a chance to remember what it was like to hear this type of theology for the first time. And I was a very conservative Christian, and for me at the time, I thought the Bible was literally word for word true, that God penned this ancient text into existence. And then I went to my first Bible class, and I remember the teacher at a conservative school, conservative class, saying that Genesis 1 was not literal as far as how it was written. It's a poem. And I was like, well, wait a minute. So God didn't create the world in 6 days? And he said, no, we still believe that, but it shouldn't be taken that way. And so I started to question things, and then I noticed in Genesis 1 and 2, there's 2 different orders of creation in both chapters. They don't match at all. It's the creation account, and neither one of them line up. So within the first 2 chapters of the Bible, there's this massive contradiction staring us in the face. And I had a choice. I could walk away from the teachings that I feel are necessary in this day and age as far as the wholesome teachings that are within the pages, or I could examine things and maybe come to a different conclusion than what I was taught for a long time. And one thing that I heard that really helped me out in this process of re-examining my faith and reconstructing what I believe about God and the Bible and Jesus is that just because something is not literally true doesn't mean there's not truth in it. And that resonated with me a lot because throughout my life, I think the most valuable thing that I received was hearing stories, or reading stories. I've got tattoos. I'm not a tough guy, I promise. This is all nerd stuff, and it's Song of Ice and Fire and The Hobbit, and it's The Never-Ending Story and Narnia, and there's quotes from these stories because they meant something to me. From The Hobbit, I have not all who wander are lost. I mean, The Hobbit didn't happen, but that's true. There's truth in that statement. So if you're in a place where you're kind of wrestling with this, and this is hard because you've been taught to believe that creation happened, in this magical way, know that just because we're saying it's not literally true, doesn't mean that there's not truth in the story. And I believe that the most truthful words that I've ever written are in the life of Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. A praxis that teaches us to care for the poor and seek justice for the oppressed. There is truth in those words. Because there's power in symbols.
Yes.
For example, the White House is just a building. But the symbol is powerful to people because we believe it is, because we put our hope in our faith in these assumptions that we have concerning these symbols. If you inject faith and hope into a symbol, you build a movement. And I think that's what Jesus wanted to do with communion. Jesus took 2 of the most plain elements that you could possibly utilize in a ceremony, and he injected truth into the symbol of bread and juice. And the symbol is this: you have a purpose to make this world better than you found it. And that responsibility has been passed on from generation to generation, and it's right there in bread and juice. There's nothing magical about the bread and juice. It's not going to turn into the body and blood of Christ, which I'm sure the vegans are very happy about. But there's something powerful in the bread and juice if we focus on the message and the intent that's behind the ceremony. So if you could pass the bread to your neighbor, pass the cup to your neighbor. Take the bread, rip off a piece, dip it into the cup, and don't eat the bread just yet. After you dunk the bread into the juice, just hold it in your hands. And when everybody's not passing the bread, I'm going to be able to see this. And until then, just kind of sit quietly and prepare yourself to hear a story, a very powerful story, whether it's true or not. And all are welcome to take this, by the way. Christian, atheist, agnostic, Buddhist, combination of that in Santa Cruz. eyes and just try to picture the scene. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, Jesus took bread and broke it. He said, "This is my body broken for you." Jesus was saying, they're coming for me. The time's come, I'm about to die. Jesus took wine, poured it into a cup, and passed it to his neighbor and said, "This is my blood. It represents a new promise. It's going to be shed for you. Take and drink, and as often as you do, do so in remembrance of me." Jesus was essentially saying, don't let this stop. My life might end, but we have to take this to the next level. We have to seek justice. We have to teach mercy and kindness and compassion, because if we don't, who will? So if you could take those elements and know that you are taking on that movement, you are taking on this truth. It may not be literally true, but I promise you, there's truth buried in these ethics. And I challenge you to take them out into the world and to stand on a soapbox and scream them to people in power. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.